The feminists would argue that that would still be an expression of the patriarchy, the fact that men are the. It's almost as if it's a catch-22. It's that toxic masculinity derives from patriarchy, and patriarchy is a male system created by men to hold women down. So in many ways, it's this male power structure that's the reason for men sacrificing their own bodies. What would you say in response to something like that?
I'd say that the world was not dominated by a patriarchy in which men made rules to benefit men at the expense of women. Rather, the world was dominated by the need to survive. And to survive historically in almost all countries, men and women, for the majority of countries, women learned to sacrifice their lives raising children, to sacrifice their lives in childbirth, and then to spend their lives raising children. And men learned to sacrifice their lives in war to protect the children that women bore. And we learned to give up doing what, once we were a dad, we learned to give up doing what we wanted to do in order to earn enough money to be able to support the family. Women learned to raise children, men learned to raise money, or historically speaking, some equivalent of that, like killing the animals and risking death. And so men have always risked being away from home, killing and being killed. Women have risked being at home. That our grandparents never talked about rights. They talked about responsibilities and obligations. Both sexes did. What the feminist movement did is to focus on women's responsibilities and obligations and call those women's restrictions and being repressed. And in fact, it was women being repressed and confined, and the same, but it was the opposite way that men were repressed and confined. The challenge is that the feminists looked at the increased money that men earned and said that's male privilege, as opposed to understanding that that was male obligation. So let's take this, down to everyday level. On an everyday level, if you ask yourself, in all my workshops, I ask people to do, to think about what the glint in your dad's eye was. And if you ever care enough to go back into your dad's life and ask him and think about what made your dad really happy, it was oftentimes, it might have been that he played music, or he loved to sing, or he loved to do art. He may not even be in touch with what made him happy. But if you ever got a hold of, talking to him about his early life and what he really loved to do, it was probably something more in the people skill oriented, or being able to be a musician or an artist, or a writer or something along those lines. And yet, when he became a father, he learned that that being an artist usually equated to starving artist, and being a musician usually meant a gig here and a gig there, and you can't support three or four children on a gig, and a wife, so you give up being an artist. Or if let's say you're an elementary school teacher, and you're a teacher, and then you realize, well, now that I have my wife, we have children, and my wife maybe wants to work part-time or cut back on her full-time work, I now have to support myself, plus part of what my wife used to produce, plus a child, plus providing for emergencies, making sure we have a good neighborhood we live in so my child can go to a good school. I can no longer be that elementary school teacher. I've got to go into being maybe a principal or a superintendent of schools. And so the feminists look at that and say, aha, more men are superintendents of schools or principals than women are. That just goes to show you that men are part of the patriarchy and they have male power. But the men shut their mouths and just say, I need to do what I need to do. My father used to be critical of me because when he saw that I was potentially going to want to become a writer, he said, Warren, you can't, only about 1 in 100 writers even find a publisher, and the average book only makes $5,000 a year. The average book only makes an author $5,000. You can't support a family with that, and if you can't find a publisher, you'll never find a wife. And there's lots of examples of that. Zelda Fitzgerald said, "I'm in love with you, F. Scott Fitzgerald, but I cannot marry you until you produce a bestseller because there's not enough stability in something like writing." And so what men did is we sacrificed our heart, our glint in our eyes, what we love to do, in order to do what we felt we needed to do. And then feminists, instead of saying, thank you, men, for making those sacrifices on the male side of things, the way women made sacrifices on the female side of things. Let's appreciate what both of our grandparents did in the past. And let's now, because we live in societies where there's more luxury, let's give us more freedom to do roles. But rather, they painted men's oppression as men being the oppressor. And it wasn't really men's oppression any more than it was women's oppression. It was both our grandparents and our great-grandparents did what they needed to do to make life better for their children and for themselves. And we should be thanking, getting on our knees and thanking our grandparents and our great-grandparents for making this world one where we were not so survival dependent.